In the summer of 2019, a foundation crew in Spartanburg, South Carolina, broke ground on what was supposed to be a routine commercial excavation. Standard job: dig down, pour footings, move on to the next site. These guys had done it 1,000 times before. But at 14 feet below the current street level, their excavator hit something that was not dirt, not clay, not bedrock. It was a polished floor, smooth, level, finished. The kind of surface you would expect inside a courthouse lobby or the grand foyer of a 19th century bank, not buried under 14 feet of earth in the middle of upstate South Carolina. The crew stopped digging. They called the foreman. The foreman came down, looked at it, and told them to keep going, break through it, pour the concrete, forget about it. And that is exactly what they did. But somebody on that crew talked. And once that story hit the corners of the internet where people actually pay attention to things like this, it opened up a question that nobody in mainstream archaeology, geology, or urban planning has been willing to answer. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. How does a polished finished floor end up 14 feet below a modern city? Who built it? And why is it buried? This is not the first time something like this has happened. And Spartanburg is not the only city sitting on top of something it cannot explain. To understand what that crew found and why it matters, we need to go back, not just a few decades. We need to go back to a version of American history that most people have never been taught, a version that the buildings themselves are trying to tell us if anyone would bother to listen. Spartanburg, South Carolina, was officially incorporated in 1831, but the structures that defined its early downtown, the courthouses, the banks, the civic halls, those buildings tell a different story. Many of them feature architectural elements that do not match the resources, the labor force, or the technical capacity of a small antebellum southern town. We are talking about massive stone foundations, arched windows with precise geometric proportions, columns with Corinthian capitals carved with a level of detail that would challenge modern stonemasons working with power tools, and basements. Deep sprawling basements with vaulted ceilings and finished walls that extend far below what any practical building code would require. Walk through the older parts of downtown Spartanburg today and you can still see remnants of this craftsmanship. Keystones set with millimeter precision above arched doorways. Foundation stones cut so cleanly that mortar was almost unnecessary, the joints tight enough to run a fingernail along and feel no gap. Iron railings with decorative scrollwork that would take a modern fabrication shop weeks to replicate with CNC equipment. This was not frontier construction. This was the work of builders who knew exactly what they were doing and had access to tools and techniques that do not appear anywhere in the local historical record. The official explanation is simple. Skilled European craftsmen built these structures using traditional methods. Case closed. Move on. But here is where that explanation starts to crack. When you look at the census records from Spartanburg in the 1830s and 1840s, the population was tiny, a few thousand people at most. The local economy ran on cotton and small-scale agriculture. There were no major quarries nearby producing the kind of dressed stone that shows up in these foundations. There were no documented workshops training the kind of artisans who could execute Corinthian column work or precision-cut archways. And there was certainly no economic incentive to build grand civic architecture for a population that could barely fill a single church on Sunday. So who built these buildings? And more importantly, what is underneath them? This is where the foundation crew's discovery starts to connect to a much larger pattern. Across the United States, from the East Coast to the Midwest, construction crews have been finding the same thing for decades. Finished floors, paved surfaces, intact walls, and entire structural systems buried far below the accepted ground level. And every single time the response from authorities is the same. Ignore it, break through it, pour your concrete, and move on. In Chicago, during the reconstruction after the Great Fire of 1871, workers discovered entire storefronts buried beneath the street, complete buildings with intact facades, doors, and windows sitting 8 to 12 feet below the new grade level. The official explanation was that Chicago had been razed in the 1850s and 1860s, a massive public works project that lifted buildings and streets to improve drainage. And that part is true. Chicago was razed. Engineers jacked up entire city blocks, sometimes with people still inside conducting business, and filled in beneath them. But what is almost never discussed is what was underneath the buildings before they were razed. Where did those lower levels come from? Why were they built to full commercial specification, with finished interiors and street-facing windows, if they were always intended to be underground? Walk through the Chicago pedway system today and you can still access parts of this buried city. Corridors that were once open-air streets, storefronts that once faced sunlight, doorways that once opened onto sidewalks where people walked and horses pulled carts, all of it sealed beneath the modern city like a time capsule that nobody was supposed to open. The same pattern shows up in Portland, Oregon, where the so-called Shanghai tunnels extend beneath the Old Town District, in Seattle, where an entire underground city exists beneath Pioneer Square, in Atlanta, where the original street level sits below modern grade, accessible through basements and sub-basements that most residents do not even know exist, and in Spartanburg, where a foundation crew hit a polished floor at 14 feet and was told to bury it again. The question is not whether these buried structures exist. They do. The evidence is overwhelming and well documented, even by mainstream sources. The question is how they got there. And on that question, the official narrative and the physical evidence are in direct conflict. The standard geological explanation for buried structures is sediment accumulation over time. Rivers flood, wind carries dust, organic material decomposes and builds up. Over centuries, the ground level rises naturally, burying whatever was at the surface, and in many cases, that explanation holds up perfectly well. Ancient Roman roads, for example, are often found several feet below modern grade, and the sediment accumulation matches what you would expect over 2,000 years of natural processes. But 14 feet in less than 200 years? In a region that is not in a floodplain, not in a river delta, not in an area prone to volcanic ash deposits or major geological events, the math does not work. Spartanburg sits on the Piedmont Plateau, a geologically stable region with moderate rainfall and well-drained clay soils. Natural sediment accumulation in this area averages roughly 1 inch per century. At that rate, burying a structure 14 feet deep would take approximately 16,000 years, not 150. Talk to any geologist off the record and they will tell you the same thing. The Piedmont does not bury things fast. It is not like a Mississippi Delta floodplain, where seasonal flooding can deposit several inches of sediment in a single event. It is not like the Pacific Northwest, where volcanic activity creates ash layers that can bury landscapes overnight. The Piedmont is stable. It is old. It is one of the most geologically predictable regions on the continent. And yet here is a polished floor 14 feet below the surface in soil conditions that cannot explain how it got there. Something else put that floor 14 feet underground, and whatever it was, it happened fast. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable for mainstream historians and geologists, because the most logical explanation, the one that actually fits the physical evidence, is also the one that challenges the entire accepted timeline of American development. The theory, supported by a growing body of architectural, photographic and geological evidence, is that many of the grand structures found across American cities were not built by the populations that history credits with their construction. They were already there, already standing, already old, and at some point, likely in the mid to late 19th century, a catastrophic event or series of events buried the lower levels of these structures under massive deposits of mud and sediment. The populations that came after simply dug out the upper floors, moved in, and claimed the buildings as their own. This is the mud flood theory, and before you dismiss it, consider the photographic evidence. Some of the earliest photographs of American cities taken in the 1860s and 1870s show something deeply strange. Building after building with ground floor windows half buried in earth, front doors that open into walls of dirt, elaborate stone facades descending below street level into what appears to be freshly deposited sediment. In some images you can clearly see where workers have dug trenches alongside buildings to access what were originally ground floor entrances, the dirt piled up beside them like grave soil. These are not basements that were designed to be underground. These are ground floors that ended up underground. And in city after city, historical records describe massive cleanup and grading projects in the decades following the Civil War, projects that involved moving enormous quantities of earth, raising streets and establishing new ground levels. The official narrative frames these projects as urban improvement, better drainage, wider streets, modern infrastructure. And those were certainly the results. But the photographs tell a different story. They show cities that look like they were recently excavated, not recently built. Buildings emerging from the ground like artifacts at an archaeological dig, with workers shoveling mud away from their facades. Spartanburg's own historical photographs show this same pattern. Images from the late 19th century depict downtown buildings with their lower levels partially obscured by earthen berms, storefronts with steps descending below grade to reach what were once ground floor entrances, and the grand civic buildings, the ones with the Corinthian columns and the precision stonework, sitting deeper in the ground than their construction dates would suggest. Now, none of this proves that an advanced pre-American civilization built Spartanburg's downtown, but it does raise a question that deserves an honest answer. If these buildings were constructed in the 1830s and 1840s by small-town craftsmen with limited resources, why do their foundations extend so far below grade? Why are those foundations finished to such a high standard? And why does a foundation crew in 2019 hit a polished floor at 14 feet, a depth that natural sediment accumulation could not explain in the time frame allowed by the official historical record? The economic dimension of this question is just as interesting as the geological one, because if you follow the money, the accepted history of American development starts to look less like organic growth and more like asset acquisition. Consider the pattern. In city after city across the United States, the same sequence plays out. A grand, architecturally sophisticated building appears in the historical record, attributed to a specific builder or civic project. But when you dig into the financial records, the costs do not add up. The labor force was too small, the materials were too expensive, the timeline was too short, and the finished product with its precision stonework, its massive foundations, its elaborate ornamentation, far exceeds what the local economy could have supported. Spartanburg is a perfect case study. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. The Spartanburg County Courthouse, built in its current iteration in the late 19th century, features architectural details that would have required a small army of highly skilled stonemasons, ironworkers, and carpenters. But the local tax records from that period show a county budget that could barely afford to maintain its roads. The population was modest. The industries were agricultural. There was no railroad hub bringing in outside labor and materials until later in the century. Run the numbers yourself. A single Corinthian column carved from solid stone would require weeks of labor from a master stonemason. The courthouse had multiple such columns, each one representing hundreds of man-hours of skilled work that someone had to pay for, house, feed, and transport. Multiply that by the full scope of the building, the foundation work, the wall construction, the roofing, the interior finishing, and you were looking at a project budget that would have consumed the entire county's revenue for years. Yet the building appears in the record as though it materialized over a single construction season, with minimal documentation of how it was funded or who performed the labor. This is not speculation. These are basic questions of construction economics. How much did it cost? Who paid? Where did the workers sleep? Where did the stone come from? How was it transported? For most major historical construction projects, these questions have detailed answers. For dozens of grand buildings in small American cities like Spartanburg, the answers are either missing or implausible. So where did the money come from? Where did the labor come from? And where did the expertise come from to build structures that rival anything produced by major eastern seaboard cities with 10 times the population and 50 times the tax base? One explanation, the one that mainstream history offers, is that these projects were funded by wealthy benefactors, built by itinerant craftsmen, and completed over longer time frames than the official records suggest. And in some cases, that is probably true. But another explanation, the one that the buried floors and half-interred facades point toward, is that these structures were not built by the communities that claimed them. They were inherited, occupied, repurposed, and the stories of their construction were written after the fact to provide an origin narrative for buildings that had no documented origin at all. This is not as outlandish as it sounds. Throughout human history, conquering or succeeding civilizations have claimed the architectural achievements of their predecessors. The Romans built on Greek foundations. Medieval European churches were constructed on top of Roman temples. The Spanish colonial administration in the Americas occupied and repurposed indigenous structures across Mexico, Central America, and South America. Claiming existing buildings as your own is not unusual. It is standard practice. The difference in the American case is the timeline. If these structures were built by a prior civilization, that civilization would have had to exist within the last few hundred years, not thousands of years ago. And that is where the Tartaria hypothesis enters the picture. The Tartaria theory, in its broadest form, suggests that a technologically advanced civilization existed across large portions of the Northern Hemisphere, including North America, until relatively recently. This civilization, linked in some interpretations to the historical Tartary referenced on old European maps, was responsible for the grand architecture, the advanced infrastructure, and the sophisticated urban planning that early photographs of American cities seem to depict. According to this theory, this civilization was destroyed or displaced by a catastrophic event, possibly a mud flood, possibly something else entirely, and its architectural legacy was claimed by the populations that came after. Mainstream historians dismiss the Tartaria theory entirely, and there are legitimate reasons for skepticism. The theory relies heavily on photographic interpretation, architectural pattern recognition, and gaps in the historical record, rather than on direct archaeological evidence or documented primary sources. It is, at this stage, a hypothesis, not a proven historical framework. But here is what mainstream historians have not done. They have not explained the buried floors. They have not explained the half-interred building facades in early photographs. They have not explained how small, resource-poor communities built architectural masterpieces that modern builders would struggle to replicate. And they have not explained why, every time a construction crew finds something anomalous underground, the standard response is to destroy it and move on. The Spartanburg floor is a perfect example. A polished, finished surface at 14 feet below grade, in a geologically stable region where natural sediment accumulation cannot account for the depth. A surface that suggests a previous ground level, a previous building, a previous use. And instead of investigating, instead of documenting, instead of asking the obvious questions, the response was to break through it and pour concrete on top. This is not how you treat an anomaly if you are genuinely interested in the truth. This is how you treat an anomaly if the truth is inconvenient, and the inconvenience runs deep. Because if the buried structures beneath American cities are evidence of a prior civilization, then the entire economic narrative of American development has to be rewritten. The story of rugged pioneers building a nation from scratch, of self-made industrialists constructing grand cities through sheer willpower and capitalist ingenuity, that story depends on the assumption that there was nothing here before, that the continent was a blank canvas, that everything was built from the ground up by the people whose names appear on the deeds and the cornerstones. But what if the canvas was not blank? What if the grand buildings were already standing? What if the infrastructure was already in place? What if the true genius of American economic development was not construction but acquisition, not creation but occupation? That is a story that no textbook is going to tell. But it is a story that the ground beneath Spartanburg and beneath dozens of other American cities is telling, whether anyone wants to hear it or not. Consider the star forts. Across the American landscape, from the Atlantic coast to the interior, massive geometric fortifications exist that are attributed to colonial-era military engineering. Fort Sumter, Fort Pulaski, the Castillo de San Marcos. These structures feature precisely angled walls, complex geometric layouts, and construction techniques that align more closely with Renaissance-era European military architecture than with anything the colonial American military had the resources or expertise to produce. The geometry alone raises questions. Star fort design requires advanced knowledge of ballistic angles, enfilade fire coverage, and precise mathematical calculations that determine the number of points, the angle of each bastion, and the depth of each ravelin. This was not folk engineering. This was applied military mathematics of the highest order, and it appeared fully formed and expertly executed in locations where the local population had no documented tradition of geometric fortification design. The standard explanation is that European military engineers designed and supervised these constructions, and for some of the more famous examples that explanation is well documented. But for dozens of smaller, less studied earthwork fortifications across the southeast, including several in the upstate South Carolina region near Spartanburg, the documentation is thin to non-existent. They appear in military surveys, they show up on old maps, but their construction dates, their builders, and their original purpose are either undocumented or attributed to groups that demonstrably lacked the engineering knowledge to produce them. The pattern repeats. Grand structures, insufficient explanations, and a historical establishment that is not interested in asking follow-up questions. The foundation crew in Spartanburg did not set out to challenge the historical narrative. They were there to dig a hole and pour concrete. But what they found, 14 feet down, was a piece of physical evidence that contradicts the story we have been told about this land and who built what is on it. A polished floor does not appear by accident. It does not form naturally. It does not grow in the soil like a mineral deposit. Someone built it, someone finished it, someone used it, and then something buried it under 14 feet of earth in a region where natural processes cannot account for that depth of accumulation in the accepted time frame. The question is not whether the floor is real. The crew saw it, the foreman saw it, it was there. The question is what we are going to do with that information. Are we going to investigate? Are we going to document? Are we going to ask the hard questions about what is beneath our cities and how it got there? Or are we going to do what the foreman told that crew to do? Break through it, pour concrete on top, forget about it, pretend it was never there. Because that is what has been happening for 150 years. Every time someone digs deep enough to find something that does not fit the accepted narrative, the response is the same. Cover it up, fill it in, move on. The buried floors beneath Spartanburg are still there. 14 feet below the street, beneath fresh concrete and new construction, a polished surface sits in the dark, waiting for someone to take it seriously. And it is not alone. Beneath Chicago, beneath Portland, beneath Seattle, beneath Atlanta, beneath dozens of cities across the United States, the same evidence sits buried. Finished walls, paved surfaces, intact structures, an entire built environment that predates the official historical record, buried under earth that should not be there. ignored by institutions that should be investigating. The next time you walk down a downtown street in an American city, look at the buildings around you. Look at the stone foundations. Look at the basement windows that sit at ground level or below. Look at the steps that descend to entrances that seem too low, too deep, too far below the current grade. And ask yourself the question that the foundation crew in Spartanburg was not allowed to ask. What is underneath? Because something is down there. It has always been down there, and every polished floor, every buried facade, every subgrade entrance is a piece of evidence in a case that nobody is prosecuting and nobody is investigating. The buildings are talking. The ground is talking. The buried floors are talking. The only question is whether anyone is willing to listen. What that crew found under Spartanburg in 2019 was not a random anomaly. It was a data point in a pattern that stretches across the entire continent. And every time that pattern is discovered, every time a crew hits something that should not be there, the same machinery of indifference kicks into gear. Ignore it. Destroy it. Forget it. But the internet changed the game, because now when a crew member talks, the story does not die in a break room. It travels, it connects with other stories, other buried floors, other impossible depths, other buildings that do not match their supposed origins. And slowly, one polished floor at a time, the real story of what is beneath our cities is beginning to surface. Not through academic investigation, not through institutional inquiry, but through the simple, stubborn persistence of people who refuse to accept that a polished floor at 14 feet is just something you pour concrete over and forget. Spartanburg is not hiding anything on purpose. The people who live there, who work there, who build there, they are not part of some grand conspiracy. They are doing their jobs, following orders, meeting deadlines. The foreman who told his crew to break through that floor was not covering up evidence. He was managing a construction schedule. But the system that trained him to treat an anomalous discovery as an obstacle rather than a question, that system is the problem. A system that prioritizes efficiency over curiosity, production over investigation, schedule over truth. That system has been burying evidence, literally and figuratively, for as long as American cities have been digging foundations. And every polished floor that gets broken through and poured over is another piece of the puzzle that disappears forever. The crew in Spartanburg did their job. They broke through the floor. They poured the concrete. The building went up on schedule. Nobody filed a report. Nobody called an archaeologist. Nobody took a core sample of the polished surface to determine its composition, its age, or its method of manufacture. The floor was an inconvenience on a construction timeline, nothing more. But somewhere in the ground beneath that building, beneath 14 feet of earth and fresh concrete and rebar and gravel, the remnants of that polished surface still exist. Cracked now, fragmented, but still there, still waiting, still asking the question that nobody in authority wants to answer. Who was here before us? What did they build? And what buried it all? Those are not fringe questions. Those are not conspiracy theories. Those are the most basic, fundamental questions that any honest examination of the physical evidence demands. A polished floor at 14 feet, in a geologically stable region, in a time frame that natural processes cannot explain. That is not a mystery to dismiss. That is a mystery to solve. And until someone with the authority, the funding, and the intellectual courage to investigate actually does so, the ground beneath Spartanburg and beneath every other American city sitting on top of evidence it cannot explain will keep its secrets, not because the evidence is hidden, but because nobody with the power to look is willing to look down. And maybe that is the most revealing piece of evidence of all. Not what is buried beneath our cities, but the absolute unwavering refusal of anyone in a position of authority to investigate what is down there. Universities with billion-dollar endowments and entire archaeology departments sitting within driving distance of buried structures they have never studied. State historic preservation offices that will spend millions documenting a 19th century farmhouse, but will not send a single intern to examine a polished floor found 14 feet underground. Federal agencies tasked with protecting cultural heritage that have never, not once, issued guidance on how construction crews should handle anomalous subterranean discoveries. The silence is not accidental, it is structural, and it is deafening.